Good afternoon. It's April Fool's Day. No foolishness here. It's the autonomouscollective.net. It's dis and dat information. Today we're going to look at critical theory in the 21st century. I've been hanging out a little bit anyway with the critical theory working group, and it certainly has been interesting to me to it affects my trying to get more background information on some of the projects I'm working on. It is, I think, necessary to consider that critical theory is probably necessary for a review of a lot of radical projects. So this is Harry F. Dom's article, Critical Theory in the 21st Century, The Logic of Capital Between Classical Social Theory, the Early Frankfurt School Critique of Political Economy, and the Prospect of Artifice. There are many different versions of critical theory, both within the tradition of the Frankfurt School, which inaugurated the idea and the concept of critical theory, and beyond the latter in the sense of feminist, post-structuralist, postmodernist, post-colonial, and queer critical theories, to name the most prominent incarnations. Still, despite the variety of critical theories, at their core, there is synchronicity with the type of critique the Frankfurt School theorists first developed and refined as they drew on the works of Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Max Weber, and other social theorists and philosophers. Yet this core, as delineated in Max Horkheimer's programmatic essay Traditional and Critical Theory of 1937, 8 decades ago, in terms of a radical philosophy of social science, ever is in danger of being pushed to the side. Though widely recognized in its importance in the interest of more immediate causes that are also consistent with the impetus of critical theories, such as agendas driven by concrete goals, like emancipation, liberation, social justice, or the elimination of suffering, or by practical concerns, including forms of praxis, directed at revolutionary or at the very least qualitative social transformation, or strategies that fall under the rubric of politics, the core of critical theory frequently has been put second or entirely ignored. Yet did and does such a core exist? If critical theory in fact did or was supposed to have a discernible core that applies to the tradition and should define the latter, and which must be viewed as sacrosanct, as it were, it should be possible to demarcate it clearly. Despite countless attempts to construct, update, or reconstruct critical theory and to formulate related working definitions, one key dimension of the programmatic core of critical theory, as promised through the early phase of the Frankfurt School and put forth strongly by Horkheimer, has been unduly overlooked or willfully ignored. In short, this neglected dimension concerns the rigorous and no less radical examination of the gravity, concrete and specific socio-historical conditions and circumstances exert on endeavors in the human sciences to eliminate the vicissitudes of successive societal configurations in the modern age. Once recognized and identified explicitly, implications result from this core concern. In no uncertain terms for the tradition's approach to scrutinizing critically, to be sure, the evolving logic of the dynamic capitalist economy at the national and global levels. So, how and in what way did the early Frankfurt School identify and deploy this program, if at all? Assuming that the tradition's programmatic core concern indeed is both unique and important, it is conceivable that it never again has been laid out as clearly, and that as a result, subsequent proponents of critical theory have been laboring to explicate what may well be most important about the tradition and its contributions to illuminating the conditions of social life in the modern age without being in the position to acknowledge the core explicitly, spell out its import rigorously, and advocate and apply it effectively. Concordantly, the potentially pernicious influence the economy exerts in and on civilization, human civilization, in recent decades, and especially at the current historical juncture, is likely not to have received the necessary attention. How capitalism, and especially the logic of capitalism, increasingly may be inversely related to the possibility of qualitative social progress and detrimental to sustaining the idea of the pursuit of the common good, also likely would have been neglected. Along the lines of a research institute designed to rely on and integrate all the human sciences, the humanities, as well as the social sciences, Horkheimer, a few years later, had initially suggested and then established an overall division of labor to be implemented and pursued at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. The members of the Institute were engaged in the critique of capitalism on three levels. On the first level, they endeavored to revitalize Marx's critique of political economy to be applied to the later stage of capitalist development reached during the first decades of the 20th century. Acknowledging the persistent and intensifying division of labor in the social sciences, Horkheimer determined that on the second level, the members and affiliates of the Institute would be responsible for specific dimensions of modern social reality. For example, for sociology, psychology, economics, or law, since each individual social science is concerned with a specific analytical and theoretical agenda and set of phenomena. Critical theorists started out from the assumption of the relative autonomy, that is, the inner logic of the social sciences' respective tasks in relation to the diverse dimensions of social life, that is, social value spheres, that are the domain of these disciplines. The goal was to critically evaluate the relative importance of different inner logics, respectively, in light of prevailing patterns, determining how exactly industrialized capitalist societies fulfill an array of functions. In this context, Frederick Pollock was responsible for providing an updated diagnosis of political economy along Marxian lines, while it fell to the community of scholars at the Institute on the third level to generate a highly sophisticated systematic critique of post-liberal capitalism and its effects on political, social, and cultural dimensions of life. As we will see, however, Pollock did not meet this challenge, but provided an analysis that derailed the Frankfurt School's commitment to continue Marx's critique of political economy at the same level of rigor and intensity. Since its inception in New York in the mid-1930s, Frankfurt School critical theory has gone through a number of permutations. Though the tradition's origins commonly and correctly have been situated in Germany in the late 1920s and 1930s, strictly speaking, the concept of critical theory was formulated in the United States by Horkheimer. It is doubtful that, at least far from certain, whether absent the need to emigrate from Germany after Hitler's rise to power, the concept would have been formulated explicitly at all. In the very least, there would have been much less of an incentive to develop as radically different a perspective on the social sciences as spelled out in Horkheimer's distinction between traditional and critical theory if the National Socialist takeover would have not occurred, and there would not have been an imminent need for the members of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt to leave Germany. The agenda of critical theory was at play even before the concept critical theory was formulated by Max Horkheimer and seconded by Herbert Marcuse in New York. Especially Horkheimer from early on had been concerned with the implications resulting from social change in early 20th century modern capitalist societies for the tools we employ in the interest of grasping the nature and direction of change. As a philosopher with a strong interest in sociology, Horkheimer understood that the key concept employed in the social sciences and the Geisteswissenschaften, the humanities, to meaningfully assess and interpret the human condition at the individual and collective level under conditions of continuous industrialization were not merely means to reflect on the nature of social change in the modern age, but also reflections and expressions of the nature of social change. Next section, critical theory in the 20th century, modern society, and the socio-logic of capital. Now, despite the many different conceptualizations and definitions of critical theory that have been formulated and advocated over the course of the last half century or so, since related debates and conflicts have accompanied efforts to advance rigorously critical analyses of modern society as a whole, or specific dimensions of the latter, there has been a single overarching concern that has distinguished Frankfurt School critical theory from other types. This theme pertains to the manner in which the spread and deepening of economics in its capitalist form has been permeating non-economic modes of life in the modern world with regard to politics, culture, and society, with discernible consequences at the levels of individual psychology and collective social psychology. Indeed, critical theory may well be understood as a explicitly stated and determined response to ongoing transformations and modulations in and across modern societies, producing both latent and manifest catastrophes that cannot be grasped nor explained adequately at the levels at which those catastrophes are discernible. Rather, especially the early critical theorists of the Frankfurt School observed and interpreted social, political, and cultural catastrophes as symptoms of an underlying economic logic of which concrete social forms are expressions to such an extent that their illumination and analysis require an understanding of causality that was novel and unexpected at the time. Especially in the mainstream social sciences and humanities, there was and continues to be to this day a notable lack of recognition that such a causality is in force, even though it had been foreshadowed both by the classics of social theory, especially Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, and even by developments in theoretical physics in terms of quantum mechanics and relativity theory, developments that coincided with the establishment of sociology as a social science during the 1890s and early 20th centuries. Put simply, modern society is sustained by a nexus of interconnected social, economic, political, and cultural processes which are mutually reinforcing and sustaining and being energized and maintained by the sum total of focused activities of a sufficiently large segment of the population whose members are willing or determined to accumulate ever more personal wealth. These processes mediate between different logics that are not as such compatible with each other, but which in modern society qua capitalism and only in this socioeconomic system are being forced into the same quote unquote wavelength, as it were, in order to ensure the stability of social order as materialized in form of a particular system of social and economic structures. Yet, the actors that are driven by the impulse to expand their wealth are neither responsible for the peculiar causality that is sustaining modern society, nor are they in control of it. Instead, they endeavor more or less successfully to tune into what appears to be the economic logic without which modern society neither could have come into existence, nor be able to maintain itself, nor expand its mode of control, both qualitatively and quantitatively, to ever greater numbers of individuals, to more and more countries and regions of the world, and to the Earth's biosphere. Next section, or no, not the next section. It is a statement. This economic logic is the logic of capital. Yet paradoxically, what appears as an economic logic is in fact is a social logic, the socio-logic of capital that is being maintained and mediated through processes whose sway and workings we're amply familiar with: alienation, anomie, and the Protestant ethic. In order to appreciate the specific nature of this logic and the specific kind of causality that it engendered, which it continues to promulgate as well as rely upon, and which is eminently incompatible with everyday life assumptions and what frequently has been referred to as quote unquote common sense. It is necessary to understand first the economic logic of capital, to begin to illuminate the latter as it began to reconstruct the human species, and along with it, inevitably, the relationship between society and nature during the 19th century was the achievement of Marx's critique of political economy. However, it was neither by accident nor as a distraction from focus on the economic logic of capital that sociology as the social science of modern society began to take shape alongside Marx's efforts. As it was concerned with the social forms that enable individuals as members of modern society to construct meaningful life histories, regardless of how rational or irrational the larger social context in fact may be, and depending on which definitions of rationality and irrationality are being employed or deployed, sociology emerged in response to indications that modern society is a highly counterintuitive system of phenomena. Importantly, the operation of modern society neither can be gleaned from what is observed directly at the surface of social processes, institutions, and forms of organization, but requires a stance on the part of sociologists that recognizes the inevitability of more and more social forms being drawn into a kind of maelstrom, which diminishes the number and strength of static social forms and increases the number and strength of dynamic forms. As Marx put, all that is solid melts into air, although, sociologically speaking, it does not melt into air, but turn into matter that can be molded according to necessity, circumstance, and context, is exceedingly adaptable and creates the appearance of social, political, and cultural forms remaining relatively stable, while the economic underground is in perpetual turmoil. Yet the non-economic forms are undergoing rapid transformations as well, even though individuals who struggle to make sense of their world and who try to pursue sensible and minimally predictable lives perceive the social world as being much more stable than it is. This condition triggers rapidly proliferating experiences of dissonance that appear to increase individuals' determination to hold on to politics, culture, and society as dimensions that provide a semblance of stability. Without this determination, which manifests and is expressed in myriad ways, modern society as capitalism presumably would not be able to prevail. And it is for this reason that it would not have been possible to explain the machinations of 20th century modern capitalist society solely, or even above all, with respect to Marx's critique of political economy. The members of the Institute for Social Research and Max Horkheimer, above all, recognize the importance of analyzing and explaining the inner workings of modern society adequately and accurately beyond the scope of traditional theory and mainstream sociology. Transcending the limits of the latter is a necessary precondition for conceiving of strategies to bring about qualitative social change consistent with shared norms and values, which, in turn, must not be a function of the repressive regime of 20th century political economy, but they require a non regressive foundation for laying the foundation for a more just society, a society in which the reconciliation of facts and norms would be conceivable in non violent fashion. Put differently, whereas diagnosing and scrutinizing modern capitalism as a system built around the promulgation of disembodied value is impossible without the contributions Marx provided, it is highly likely that without a thorough and refined understanding of how the logic of capital is mediated in modern society through social, political, and cultural forms, how modern capitalism rests and is contingent on the socio-logic of capital, as addressed in studies, especially by Emil Durkheim and Max Weber, desirable and practically conceivable strategies for advancing qualitative social transformations are likely to be unattainable. Indeed, one of the many reasons why Marx's vision of a better world may may well have been perverted, betrayed, and abandoned is that Marx's diagnostic tools on their own might not be a suitable basis for developing effective strategies to prepare and execute qualitative social change in the absence of insights generated by a kind of critical sociology inspired by and capable of appreciating the critical impetus of Durkheim's and Weber's respective conceptualizations of the responsibility of sociologists to acknowledge and illuminate that peculiar causality alluded to earlier. That's a heck of a sentence. As a consequence, the challenge of illuminating change in modern society has three imminent implications. First, the meaning of guiding concepts is not static, but changes with changing conditions in modern society, which, considering its accelerating pace of change, produces an ever greater need to be cognizant of this fact. Secondly, to grasp modern society accurately, it is necessary to assess the gravity social socio-historical circumstances exert on the process of illuminating modern society. The gravity that concrete socio-historical circumstances exert on the process of illuminating modern society. Thirdly, if both the changing meaning of concepts and the gravity of socio-historical conditions are recognized sufficiently in their specificity, then both the concepts and the specific socio-historical conditions can serve as means to identify the nature and track the direction of socio-historical change in specific contexts. All three challenges must be met in order to circumscribe the constitutional logic of modern society. If successful, this process constitutes a form of radical basic research. Identifying the constitutional logic of modern society is a necessary precondition for developing research agendas in the social sciences and humanities that relate constructively to the nature of their challenges, respectively. The goal is for the sciences and humanities discipline to contribute to illuminating the constitutional logic further, rather than getting caught up in the machinations of modern society and ascribing significance and causality to factors and phenomena that are surface appearances, rather than in any way related to underlying forces. This approach is radical in the sense that it is committed to follow the logic of the challenge at hand, rather than framing the challenge itself in relation to the specificity of socio-historical conditions and their imperatives and preference with regard to how social science challenges are to be postulated. Since the beginning of critical theory, the significance of the three implications for how to position social research has been watered down further and further. In the first generation, it was most conspicuously present, partly due to their experience during the 1930s and 40s, although not consistently across the different members of the Institute for Social Research. Today, we need a new focal point for criticizing the current condition conceptually by radicalizing the tradition that began with the critique of alienation in the early Marx, continued with his later critique of commodity fetishism, morphed into Lukács's critique of reification, to be followed by Horkheimer's critique of instrumental reason and Adorno's critique of identity thinking. With Habermas's theory of communicative action as a critique of functionalist reason, which implicitly presumed and codified the purported achievements of the post-war Cold War era, and which, from today's perspective, evidently are turning out not to be of reliably lasting nature, the tradition began to take on a much more traditional, as opposed to rigorously critical, veneer, which to date has culminated in Axel Honneth's recognition paradigm. My proposal, that is Dom's proposal, for focusing critical theory's energies in our age, the 21st century, is the concept of artifice. Next section, classical social theory and the transition from spirit to capital. The classics of social theory, above all Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, were concerned with identifying and making accessible in rigorous fashion processes that violated established notions of causality in natural science, philosophy, and political economy as the precursor of economics as a social science. A.R. Lacey has defined causal principle as follows. Name for a variety of principles, such as that every event has a cause, that the same cause must have the same effect, or that the cause must have at least as much reality as the effect. This last principle, somewhat akin to the principle of sufficient reason, usually says that what causes something to be of a certain sort must itself be of that sort to at least the same degree. For example, what makes something hot must itself be hot. This goes back to Aristotle's principle that actuality is prior to potentiality. That is, what is potentially so and so can only be made actually so by something that is itself actually so. What Marx, Durkheim, and Weber discovered in different yet compatible and complementary ways as a consequence of different guiding interests and with different results is that modern society relies on a set of processes that persistently mediate between a large-scale economic process based on capital accumulation and industrialization and social, political, and cultural processes that range from the level of the individual to the level of the nation state, from the minutest human experiences to the condition of humanity and social civilization. Undeniably, there is a link between how human beings economize and how society relates to nature. Today, this link is tangible in the most conspicuous ways. For example, in the fact that between 1970 and 2010, the global population of vertebrate animals has decreased by 52%, whereas the global human population has doubled within the same time frame from approximately 3.5 billion to approximately 7 billion people. In broad strokes, and partly relying on the writings of Dieter Wolf, we may conceive of the formation of modern society as the transition during the 17th century from nature to spirit, as traced and spelled out in Hegel's dialectical philosophy. According to Hegel's rendering of German idealism, the human condition until the end of the Middle Ages was a function of nature as the force to be reckoned with. How human beings organized their lives individually and collectively was a response to the fact that nature was beyond control. Even though humans for eons had made efforts to control nature's potentially destructive power, success was limited. As a consequence of the Age of Enlightenment, however, the prospect of humans understanding the world they inhabit sufficiently well for their mode of existence no longer to be, at least not in the same level of intensity, a function of nature, appeared on the horizon of the future. Relying on Kant's critiques as a necessary mode for relating to the world in an enlightened fashion, i.e., for the first time somewhat realistically, as opposed to through religion, and in turn also critiquing the historically insensitive and limited purview of Kant's critiques, Hegel posited that human existence, if understood properly and deeply, should be a function of quote unquote spirit as the capacity to relate to reality at all levels by means of the self reflective intellect and the ability to reason. However, as spirit started asserting itself alongside the formation of a novel type of society with dimensions both civil and bourgeois, it did so with the proverbial wings of republican politics entwined with the establishment of market economies. Both facilitated the process of industrialization and took the form of what Marx analyzed and criticized along different lines as a social structure centered on the bourgeoisie as the newly ruling class. Modern society as bourgeois society continued to evolve in a manner that appeared to be conducive to what Hegel had identified as the civil dimension of modern society, as the corollary of its bourgeois dimension. Yet the latter established itself at the expense of the former and was conducive to transforming incipient market economies into economies based on the capitalist mode of production, capitalism. Ergo, the promise for the future of human history that opened up with a shift in the human condition and its corresponding form of social organization, that is, modern society, from society as a function of nature to a function of spirit, was warped when spirit took on the form of capital as the first kind of quote unquote artificial intelligence, a contorted and severely delimited and limited form of spirit, as Horkheimer and Adorno laid out in terms of the critique of instrumental reason. As I've pointed out elsewhere, and will illustrate in the next section, even though the critique of instrumental reason resulted from the early critical theorists' reliance of Pollock's highly flawed rendering of the critique of political economy, the impetus in the early Frankfurt School to illuminate the phenomenon I am referring to here as the logic of capital, though not the corresponding terminology, as logic of capital is a recent device, was strong enough, the logic of capital was strong enough to advance the cause of critical theory to the next level. Next section. The plight of the early Frankfurt School's critical theory of political economy. As far as the analysis of economic conditions, forms of economic organization, and economic processes in modern capitalist societies is concerned, plight characterizes the early Frankfurt School and the project of critical theory in at least three regards. Plight applies generally to classical critical theorists' lack of success during the 1930s and 40s in deepening further the mode of analysis Marx had developed in his critique of political economy, with regard to subsequent incarnations of capitalism at a comparable level of rigor and precision. Plight also applied, in particular, to the specific contribution made by the designated economist at the Institute for Social Research, Friedrich Pollock, who from the 1920s to the early 1940s focused to a greater extent on political rather than economic categories and dimensions of societal change. Finally, plight also applied in the sense of pledge or promise, even though the Frankfurt School never was entirely successful in explicating once and for all and precisely the pivotal purpose and distinguishing features of its diagnoses of the continuous reconfiguration of capitalism among the human sciences, the tradition emerged as the determined effort and concurrent commitment to put forth a mode of analyzing and scrutinizing the link between the economy on the one hand and politics, culture, and society on the other, to discern and highlight the problematic character of their relationship, whose importance for human existence has been increasing since the beginning of the modern age. Yet pointing out the Frankfurt School's plight with regard to economic analysis is not to suggest that the tradition's achievements, especially the particular mode of reflexivity its representatives have been pursuing and advocating as indispensable to both social theory and the human sciences, are any less remarkable and significant, particularly to the history of political and social thought. Nor does acknowledgement of plight, when viewed from today's vantage point, necessarily translate into the claim that the early Frankfurt School's analyses of capitalist economic issues, and especially its overall agenda, were without value. Rather, despite and perhaps in part because of the nature of this plight and the corresponding neglect of the critique of political economy, the main representatives of the first generation, above all Horkheimer, Marcuse, and Adorno, were able to develop a specific mode of analyzing and scrutinizing modern capitalism, whose pertinence and acuity has continued to grow in subsequent decades. The classical critical theorist concerns are especially relevant with regard to vexing aspects of the dynamic relationship between politics, economics, society, and culture that a more sophisticated critique of political economy may have neglected. Still, by the latter part of the 20th century, evidence had begun to mount for the need for critical theory to engage in rigorous and systematically focused analysis of political economy, a need that has turned into imminent urgency in the early 21st century, not least because of the acceleration of social change and of life in society. Since Horkheimer envisioned the core of critical theory as an explicit and systematic engagement with the gravity that concrete social historical conditions exert on the process of social research and the development of the theory of society, including especially critical theory itself, it is necessary to establish how exactly concrete socio-historical conditions facilitate and impede the formulation of research questions and the pursuit of research and theory. Lack of concern with regard to this issue translates more or less directly into a process of normalizing that which is specific, unusual, and especially problematic in a manner that perpetuates and solidifies the defining features of particular societal circumstances in time and space. In modern capitalist societies, moreover, how precisely societies are modern and capitalist must be considered, recognized, and explicated fully in order to reduce as much as possible the likelihood that the formation of questions and the processes of research and theory formation themselves reflect and are expressions of existing societal conditions. For instance, if modern capitalism is fraught with competition and the Protestant work ethic, it is inevitable that research and theory replicate, perpetuate, and deepen competition and work ethic, paradoxically, in the attempt to illuminate how competition and work ethic are integral to modern society. Critical theory emerged as the explicit effort to track and trace the permutations of social life that resulted from the ongoing dynamics of capitalist market economies as they changed, as it were, under the feet, around the bodies, and above the heads of people living their lives more or less successfully in what they experienced as the normalcy of everyday life. Yet this experience was saturated by patterns endemic to corporate capitalism without individuals being fully cognizant of this fact. And in the absence of categories and tools conducive to illuminating this condition, interpreting the latter as natural and inevitable characteristics of life in mass societies. In the reception of Horkheimer's classical essay, that is traditional and, critical theory, etc., 1937, this aspect has been overlooked or de-emphasized with a certain degree of consistency to the detriment of the kind and quality of contributions critical theorists could and should have made since the 1930s. In classical critical theory, the aspiration to confront this issue persisted latently in the transposition of Marx's corresponding contentions as they preceded the philosophy of social science and never fully materialized. In subsequent generations, the aspiration largely disappeared. There are two primary reasons for this initial latency and subsequent disappearance. First, critical theory constitutionally emerged as an explicitly comparative project, as it was grounded in the concrete life experiences of its proponents who had reached adulthood in Germany and who fully engaged in the process of social research only in exile in the United States. Even though the programmatic conceptualization of critical theory came about in New York in the 1930s, this fact has tended to be downplayed as only marginally relevant. Yet, contrary to most later critical theorists, the early members of the Institute for Social Research lived in, actively experienced, and reflected upon three different incarnations of modern society. Most of the members had reached adulthood in Weimar Germany, which at least nominally was a democratic republic, and then underwent the transformation of an incomplete modern society into a form of social organization that at the same time was, in some regards, rabidly anti-modernist with regard to cultural modernity, and in others, radically hyper-modernist with regard to rationalizing modernization, depending on how we endow the meaning of modern. After having experienced three versions of modern society in Germany, if we include the warped modernity of the imperial period that ended in military defeat and socialist revolution in 1918, the early critical theorists experienced and lived in a fourth version of modern society upon their arrival in the United States. Horkheimer's contention of the need to scrutinize the bearing specific socio-historical circumstances have on the human sciences, including critical theory, indeed does reflect that his work is expressive of the fact that it is not possible to develop an adequate theory of modern society and corresponding understanding of critical theory solely on the basis of extensive primary experience with one single version of modern society. After all, in the absence of the opportunity to compare at least two incarnations of modern societies, it is difficult to conceive of a reliable safeguard against conflating unique features of one's own particular modern society with features of the genus that is modern society in general. In this context, Pollock's task was to accomplish for the 1930s what Hilferding had achieved in 1910, namely to provide a study of the latest phase of capitalist development, as Hilferding had subtitled Finance Capital. However, while Hilferding did not claim to treat the later stage of capitalist development as qualitatively different politico-economic and socio-economic arrangement, but merely as the continuation of the logic Marx had identified, Horkheimer and Pollock started out from the assumption that the political economy that emerged during the 1920s, and especially during the 1930s, called for a different type of critique. As a result, the early Frankfurt School's critique of capitalism took the form, on the one hand, and under the leadership of Horkheimer, of a social political critique of Western civilization in the spirit of Marx's critiques of alienation and commodity fetishism that culminated in the Dialectic of Enlightenment of 1947. On the other hand, in the hands of Pollock, the critique manifests itself as a peculiar hybrid between traditional economic theory and a positive reading of Marx in terms of quote unquote state capitalism, indeed, as a form of traditional Marxism. In combination with Adorno's appropriation of Lukács's reconstruction of Marx's critique of alienation within this framework of Marx's later critique of commodity fetishism in terms of reification, the early critical theorists' critique of capitalism thus culminated as a critique of instrumental reason. The agenda of the early Frankfurt School translated into the interpretation and experience of a socially constructed world. Really, a world constructed by capitalism that is experienced, that is being experienced and interpreted as social and socially constructed, as given as if it were possible to presume the existence of life in modern society once and for all. Whereas critical theory is a radical form of epistemology, that is, patterns of social life exist not in persistent forms, but as expressions of the transmutations of the logic of capital. It is here that Pollock failed. Critical theory, as rendered here in the spirit of Horkheimer, must have been alien to his thought, as he was not able to look through the facade of capitalism to the forms that result from it and reveal its logic. In his most controversial contribution, published in 1941 and entitled State Capitalism, Its Possibilities and Limitations, Pollock identified as the key to analyzing capitalism the ideal typical concept of state capitalism, contending that the latter had constituted the vanishing point for analyzing advanced capitalism and had reached its height in National Socialism, though this general trend could be observed elsewhere also. The central feature of state capitalism was the suspension of the market mechanism in economies dominated by large corporations. In state capitalist societies, the primacy of the economy, characteristic of liberal capitalism, had been replaced by the primacy of the state. Pollock introduced a set of critical distinctions, of crucial distinctions. First, four aspects of the new economy are better explained in terms of state capitalism than in terms of the primacy and relative autonomy of the economic sphere, such as state-organized private property, monopoly capitalism, managerial society, administrative capitalism, bureaucratic collectivism, and others. The four aspects are: state capitalism is the successor of private capitalism. The state assumes important functions of the private capitalists. Profit interests still play a significant role, and it's not socialism. Private capitalism had been succeeded by a non-private public form of capitalism. Medium-sized businesses that had dominated the industrial economies of the later 19th centuries had been replaced by monopolistic enterprises during the early decades of the 20th century. And 19th century categories of political economy, as well as its Marxian critique, have been superseded by early 20th century political economy. Indeed, the utility of core categories and distinctions of economic theory, such as market versus planning, private versus public, had become doubtful. Instead of providing a compelling economic argument as to why the larger size of businesses mattered, independently of related implications for the market planning and private-public distinctions, Pollock asserted that with the rise of monopolistic economic organizations, the administrative state had turned into a central economic player. Pollock distinguished two forms of state capitalism: totalitarian state capitalism and democratic state capitalism, whose respective nature can vary greatly depending on the specific form of government and the social groups that control it. With the economic process not being fully manageable, three related concerns arise. The first is, what are the ends of economic production? Number two, what is the purpose of it being administered? Number three, who are the administrators and distributors of economic output? With reference to this new set of rules, Pollock distinguished between market capitalism as an economy where men meet as agents of the exchange process, as buyers or sellers, as opposed to state capitalism as a system where men meet as commander or commanded, especially with regard to the working population. Yet Pollock skirted the issue of the inner logic of both economic production and distribution and asserted that in state capitalism, the profit motive is replaced by the power motive. Though Pollock might have considered necessary conditions for level of productivity reached during the early 20th century in the most advanced industrial societies to be maintained, once large corporations were subject to state supervision and regulation in state capitalism, he did not do so. Instead, he assumed that once high levels of industrial production had been reached, a shift of society's economic planning function from monopolistic corporations to the state would not be detrimental to productivity. In state capitalism, there is no longer a need to heed the inner logic of the economic process as the entrepreneurial and capitalist functions are being interfered with or taken over by management and the government. Private ownership of production and distribution facilities will continue, but control of monopolistic industries and their enterprises will be in the hands of government. Pollock also presented arguments for why there can be an adequate incentive structure for a state capitalist system, why the separation of price and production will not hurt the latter, why the state capitalist system does not need to suffer from the kind of wastefulness and inefficiency characteristic of market capitalism, and why economics as a social science will lose its object. A new ruling class of key bureaucrats in the business, state, and party that are allied with the remaining vested interests will control the economy, and capitalists of old lose any necessary social function, although free possessions and owners of small and medium-sized businesses will play a role. The majority, that is, salaried employees, are subject to the leader principle of command and obedience. Appearance and essence of the new state will be one: embodiment of power, an instrument of the ruling class. Yet can a non-totalitarian democratic form of state capitalism function? If our thesis proves to be correct, Pollock wrote, society on its present level can overcome the handicaps of the market system by economic planning. Some of the best brains of the United States are studying the problem of how such planning can be done in a democratic way, but a great amount of theoretical work will have to be performed before answers to every question will be forthcoming. Economics as a social science will become superfluous, ironically, along with the critique of political economy pointing out that economics is the ideology of capitalism. Since state capitalism was capable of covering up and domesticating class conflict and social inequality by means of full employment, this non-progressive form of social, political, and economic organization even would be able to manage successfully the danger of social and political unrest resulting from remaining underlying economic contradictions. For this reason, as well as due to its economic superiority, Pollock regarded state capitalism as a social formation that, once in place, could continue to exist for a long period of time. In Pollock's view, the logic of capital accumulation followed closely the patterns characteristic of liberal capitalism, and thus did not call for a thorough revision of the motive analysis in Marx's critique of political economy, nor whether and to what degree the categories of classical economic theory Marx had criticized were still viable. As a consequence, uh, Pollock's analysis was not a critique of political economy in the Marxian sense, state capitalism, or totalitarian monopoly capitalism. To be sure, given the relative lack of an infrastructure conducive for focused economic analysis at the Institute, Pollock was in a poor position to take on the challenge of updating Marx's critique of political economy for post-liberal capitalism on his own. By contrast, in his major work, Behemoth, his first the first comprehensive study of National Socialism, dem Nazis, Franz Neumann rejected Pollock's analysis. The very term state capitalism is a contradictio in adjecto and proposed instead the concept of totalitarian monopoly capitalism. Neumann insisted that the market process had not been suspended in National Socialism, but rather exposed the Nazi government to tremendous economic and financial pressure. The capitalist mode of production continued unabated, albeit in a highly organized, integrated, and state coordinated fashion. The difference between state capitalism and totalitarian monopoly capitalism is more than nomenclature. Pollock's term places greater emphasis on the state than Neumann. As far as the inner logic of the economy is concerned, to Pollock, state capitalism signifies a qualitative transformation expressing the shift of society's economic planning function from the economy to the state. To Neumann, by contrast, in Nazi Germany, the economic planning function continues to be held by large corporations, many of which actively supported the Nazi regime, using politics to curry favorable business conditions. Neumann also cautioned that Pollock's vision amounted to the proclamation of the end of history and the demise of any possibility for future qualitative societal transformations. Both state capitalism and totalitarian monopoly capitalism imply more manifestly cooperative forms of business-government relations. The difference is mainly one of emphasis, particularly in light of the fact that Pollock presented state capitalism as an ideal typical model. State capitalism stressed the amplified role of the state, whereas totalitarian monopoly capitalism ceded more importance to the economy. More importantly, however, this difference signals distinct modes of theorizing the inner logic of the economic process. According to Pollock, compared to the challenge of understanding the politics of state capitalism, the inner logic of capitalist production is secondary. According to Neumann, the inner logic of capitalist production and its understanding remain central. It is not possible to discern the nature of totalitarian monopoly capitalism without sophisticated grasp on the inner logic of the economic process under changing conditions and its relative independence from the state. Horkheimer initially had considered this new development in the relationship between economy and the state a temporary return to an authoritarian form of government. By 1940, however, Horkheimer agreed with Pollock that the rise of authoritarian regimes like National Socialism was not an aberration in the logic of capitalist development, but a necessary consequence under conditions where capitalist production had created its own potential undoing the Great Depression. Let me stop there and remind you that these are the same kinds of conclusions that Martin Jay comes with from his history of the Institute for Social Research and is, worth a review on one's part. Let me stop now because I've reached the end of my little time here and review if there are any questions. All thumbs, hot dog school. All right. Well, that being said, um, let me say that I'm going to shut off the live stream and we can get back to other matters. At the top of the hour is the red hour, wherein we read short stories, fictional largely, and hope you'll stick around for that. Thank you very much.